2 minutes? My name is Brian Devereaux. I'm a reporter with a website called The Intercept. It's based here in New York City. I'm not here to talk about my experience of being surveilled, but more from the perspective of a journalist who's kind of my beat sort of national security and criminal justice, but that often intersects with surveillance, obviously, for obvious reasons. So I'll tell you guys a little bit about where I'm at with the site that I work at, because that will go a long way in explaining how I come to interact with these issues. So our site was founded by Greenwald, Vera Project, and Jeremy Scahill, and Glenn and Laura were the journalists who initially received the documents from Edward Snowden, revealing massive surveillance by the NSA. So they decided last year to start up their own site. So that's where we're at right now. So we have those, and basically, so some of the stories that I've worked on over the last year since we launched, we revealed the NSA's surveillance of the Bahamas, which is an interesting story I worked on earlier this year, which we found that the NSA was using the Bahamas as a test bed for a surveillance program in which they gathered all of the phone conversations, including content going on in the Bahamas, out of the Bahamas to other places, and into the Bahamas, so everything that was going on. They were recording all of it, and they were holding on to those conversations for up to 30 days so that they could go back and, if they wanted to, sort of plumb those conversations, look for anything interesting. The idea was to use the Bahamas as a laboratory so that they could expand this kind of system elsewhere. They used the DEA as a sort of proxy to gain access to the telephone networks there. It was a total shady operation, and the lawmakers in the Bahamas were quite pissed off when they learned that this was going on. Another story that we did that was not based on the Snowden documents that I worked with my colleague Jeremy. A couple stories that we did over the summer that pertained directly to surveillance were about the government's watch listing efforts. I think it was in July, we published this 166-page document laying out the government's entire guidelines for watch listing people. So watch listing is how it's a broad term that refers to a lot of things. Watch listing is the process by which someone ends up on a no-fly list, or a list that the government uses to subject you to extended screening at the airport. So this document that we obtained was kind of just remarkable because it really laid bare how broad and malleable those sorts of definitions are. Like basically every single section in there had some sort of exception that would allow the government to, if they wanted to, label you a terrorist based on some reasonable suspicion, or if they didn't have reasonable suspicion, then they had an exception for reasonable suspicion that could still allow you to become labeled a terrorist, and you would never know. And you might be getting hassled at the airport. You don't know why. It's because you're on this list. It was a really interesting story that we got to work on. We published the entire document, and then shortly thereafter, we did another story on the watch listing program, revealing how in the government's largest terrorism database, they've collected the identities of 1 million people since 9/11. It's this huge, sprawling database, and they share that information through a sort of wide network of other agencies, and that information is funneled into the terrorism screening database, which is what government officials call the watch list. And that set of information is shared with private companies, local law enforcement, foreign governments, and so if you get pulled over by a cop, they'll run your name, and your name will go into a system which will check the terrorism screening database, and you might pop up as a known or suspected terrorist, which could subject you to more intense sort of scrutiny from a police officer. So we published a set of documents sort of laying out that whole system by the numbers, exactly how many people the government had as of 2013 on that TSDB list, on the watch list, how many people they had on the Time database, the larger database that I was referring to. We revealed the top 5 cities in which the government has located known or suspected terrorists, which turned out to be sort of interesting because the the cities included New York City, included Houston, Los Angeles, Chicago, which are all, those are large cities, so that's kind of to be expected. But the second, the number 2 city on their list was Dearborn, Michigan, which is really interesting because Dearborn is a fairly small city, but it's also home to the largest Arab population outside the Middle East. It's home to the United States' largest mosque, and it's hard to look at Dearborn's presence in that top 5 ranking and not sort of draw some conclusions about the way the government directs its surveillance, the U.S. government. So yeah, those were some of the big stories that we've worked on over the summer since our site has rolled out. Yeah, I didn't prepare a big speech for you guys or anything like that because I'm really interested in sort of talking to the audience. But in the process of starting this site and working at the Intercept and working on the Snowden documents and working on other national security stories, it's become just abundantly clear. It was clear to me before that since 9/11, the United States has built up an apparatus, national security apparatus, a surveillance apparatus that's unparalleled and historic. But when you're working on these issues and when you start talking to the people that work in that world, you begin to understand just how big it really is, and it's stunning. I don't mean to say that. I don't mean to scare people or anything like that. I don't want anyone to walk out of here scared. I just think people should. I want people to understand that we're living in. It's sort of cliche to say that you're living in a historic time, but since 2001, this country has changed really dramatically, and the national security state that exists right now is absolutely massive and gathering so much information all the time. All of these devices that we carry around are basically, spouting out information all of the time that's picked up. It's not that the government is some all-seeing eye of Sauron or something, or that it's totally powerful, can do everything that it wants. Like, these are institutions made of people that make mistakes, and there are analysts working in these agencies who are just trying to get a paycheck, go home, do their job, go home. There are people in there who are not like that. There are racist people who work in government, just like there are in other places. There are people who try and climb a ladder, impress a boss. But these institutions do exist, and they do have a tremendous amount of technology and are constantly, spying on us. I don't know what else to really say. I'm more interested in answering your questions, but yeah. Yeah, go for it.
What has been, when you publish something like the watch list, how people are watch listed, what happens after that?
I can go into it somewhat. The government gets angry. They do not like it when you publish their documents. So they, generally speaking, so under this administration, under the Obama administration, the White House, the Justice Department, has gone after journalists and their sources at a unprecedented rate. More sources for journalists charged with the Espionage Act, which is this law from 1917 that the government trots out anytime some national security reporter gets a hold of a source who wants to give them information that is not flattering for the government. They'll try to find that source and they'll try to charge that person with espionage, with being a spy, basically. And they will target you, they will target the journalist, they will target the institution, they will try to do everything that they possibly can to find that source. And right now, there's an ongoing case with one of the New York Times best investigative reporters, James Risen, who's facing jail time because he's refusing to give up his source. This administration has charged more sources with the Espionage Act than every administration of the United States government in the history of this country combined. So they get mad. They get really, really mad. So as journalists covering issues of national security, surveillance, and those sorts of things, you sometimes have to resort to really extreme, sort of crazy measures just to report, just to talk to people, and just to communicate with your colleagues. Everything that we do related to sensitive stories is all, through encrypted email, through encrypted chats, through encrypted phone calls, and even that you feel like if the government wants to get you, if they want to read your communications, if they can get in, once they're in, they own everything. It doesn't matter if you're encrypting anything. It doesn't matter at all. So, it's frustrating and it can be overwhelming and scary. I mean, you get to the point where you feel sometimes like you're acting like a spy, just trying to talk to people that you're working with about what you're working on. You try to meet with sources in person instead of talking to them on the phone, or instead of communicating with them via email, because all of those systems are pretty much compromised. Which is challenging because most people don't use encryption. Most people don't have, apps for talking on their phone with encrypted calls. So you have to sort of guide sources through doing that sort of thing. I mean, in the case of Snowden, it's fortunate that you're talking about an extremely brilliant person who knows how to already do that stuff and knows how to approach journalists in a secure way. But it's short answer. They don't like it, and they're trying to destroy your life. I don't know. Anything else you want to? Or maybe we can do the question thing after the.
Yeah, we can do it. Well, does one person from the audience have a question for Ryan? We are doing.
Always watching everything you're doing because you feel like you're always being watched.
Yeah, and it can even become isolating when you choose to only use certain forms of communicating. Not everybody wants to use PGP to communicate with you over email. Not everybody wants to use Wicker. Not everybody wants to use all these other tools. So you kind of limit the number of conversations you have if you choose to live that lifestyle. But I think there is an advantage, and maybe this is, a way that trends in culture is changing. That this is a report from The Economist, but I found it really interesting that people who have a lot of apps, like a lot of social apps, Instagram, Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, tend to perform less well in that job. So employers will algorithmically rank people who have a lot of these apps lower than people who have only 2 or 3. So there are, in terms of parsing your leaky social media app lifestyle, there are some advantages to that in terms of game time, for instance.
Yeah. So download more apps.
Less.
Thank you, Ryan, for speaking, and thank you,
And
Adam,
thank
for
you so
adding
much
to the dialogue.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so great that this panel shows how surveillance can infiltrate all, politics, journalism, photography, and art and poetry. It's just, I think all of you will be experts on surveillance by the end of this. I would like to welcome our final panelist, Adama. Say next to me, and do you want to welcome Sue?
Yes.
Oh, and she'll be sharing her story, and we would like to welcome Sue, the producer of her story, to the stage. Okay.
Okay, again, my name is Adama Bah. My parents moved to the United States at the age of 1 year old. And at the age of 16, I was detained and I was accused of being a suicide bomb. I don't know how that happened, but it happened. I spent 6.5 weeks in juvenile detention center. During that time, I was interrogated. I went through harsh verbal abuse from the guards. Each time the FBI, CIA, and ICE, which is the immigration, interrogated me, they always said, we were watching you. So if you lied to us, we know. So each time they would say this, then I'm like, why are you asking me this question? But, I guess that's their tactics, sorry. I think 2 weeks into being to the juvenile center, they came with huge files that came from my hard drive from my computer with all these emails, photos, and everything, and just asking me, who's this, who's that, who's this, what's going on? Again, I do not know what was going on. I was 16, I did not know I was illegal. So much things were going on. After being detained, I'm fast forwarding. In order to be released, I had to agree to an electronic monitor, which is an ankle bracelet that they put on my ankle, and I had a curfew. I wore this ankle bracelet for 3 years of my life. They monitored where I went, what I did during that 3 years. After winning my immigration case and I received the green card, the ankle bracelet was removed. I thought I was done with the government. No. I decided to fly 3 times, and those 3 occasions I was on a no-fly list. I don't know how I got on a no-fly list, and there was no way to get off until we filed a lawsuit. And that was the only way I could get off. Finally, a close friend of mine named David offered to do a documentary, telling my story, telling the world that I'm innocent. I agreed to do the documentary, which was somewhere back there. And I had these camera crew just follow me in my house with my family, so to tell my story. So if you guys get a chance, just buy the DVD. And Sue, if you can come up here and speak a little.
No. I'm not there.
Okay. Sorry, I was talking fast, but I didn't know if I guess we can just go to questions, Q&A.
Okay, first, could y'all give our panelists a round of applause? Saeed over here will be taking the stack. Could I, if you have a question, please raise your hand if you don't mind coming up to the say it in the mic.
Yeah, I guess what I'd like you to talk about is how is this stuff being used, because they're collecting fiendish amounts of information. Who's got the time to go through all of it? You have recordings of, you have every number that was called on the NSA database. Who's got time to, to go through all that? So the question, how do you think it's being used? My sense is that they have a fairly small number of people who they're actively tracking, whether they're activists or suspected Al-Qaeda people or whatever, and then for everybody else it's just like the data's there if we want to try to reconstruct your actions for the last month or the last year or whatever. Do you think that's accurate?
Yes. Thank you. That's a really good question. How do people actually go through all this data and film?
It's a good question. I mean, if you look at recent, basically, since 9/11, if you look at like the National Counterterrorism Center, National Counterterrorism Center is the government organization sort of in charge of consolidating all of the terrorism-related information that's funneled from local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, and the intelligence community, up the chain. And NCTC for years has been criticized for basically building these giant haystacks of information that make it much harder to find the needle that they're looking for, right? So the government is constantly, these analysts are constantly dealing with an overload of information. If you look at the case of the Boston bombing, the older Sonya brother traveled to Russia for the attacks, and Russian intelligence was telling the United States, this guy looks shady, you should keep an eye on this guy. And he was watch listed, but he wasn't on the no-fly list. He passed through JFK, back to Russia and then back to the United States again without being stopped, without being questioned. This was shortly before the bombing happened. He was believed to have gone and met with some militants there. When the FBI later investigated how the bombing happened, the analyst who was sort of on duty that day as 9/11 was passing through JFK was saying that, he was just the lowest priority on our list of hundreds of people who were passing through JFK that day. Basically, the point there being that they, in their sort of efforts to know everything, the government has created problems for itself, where it's gathering so much information on so many people that it's just overloaded. And it's not the case that they're focusing on, like we said, like maybe they're focusing on a small number of people. It's not really true. The TSDB, Terrorism Screening Database, the actual watch list contains, as of 2013, it was almost 700,000 people. Over a third of those people had no known affiliation to a terrorist group, but those are all people on the government's actual official watch list, the U.S. government. So they're big numbers. They're looking at tons and tons of people. It becomes basically impossible to do any sort of accurate assessment of individual people when you're dealing with big numbers that large.
I'd like to, Steve, I think I can answer, I know you, a more direct answer. Recently, 42 surveillance who worked for the Israeli Defense Forces resigned and released a public denunciation of their employers, because what they were doing as surveillance were not only watching Palestinians, but targeting them for blackmail. And that's what the surveillance is for. I don't believe that it's simply there to be used at a future time. It's very active in blackmailing people, as in Palestinians, blackmail them to collaborate with the IDF. And it's also a very good thing to defame somebody, so that if you offer to blackmail somebody and they refuse to be blackmailed, you can go public with their sexual history and humiliate them. And there's been a number of instances of this. I think Scott Ritter is the best instance. Somebody who was very clear about the fact that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But now when you mention the name Scott Ritter to people, you know that he went off to Maryland to try to find a 14-year-old girl. And that's defamation. He may very well have been interested in the girl. But Scott Ritter is also one of the few people who indicated at the time that there were no weapons of destruction in Iraq. So to my mind, this intelligence that is being used by the government is being acted upon constantly, and mostly in very dirty business.
Yeah, that's really true. With those huge numbers of people, they're basically building large pools of potential informants. They don't. It's not that they have a great lead on all of these people. They just have something that they can hold over the heads of lots and lots of folks. You're on this list. Why are you on this terrorist list? Tell us what you know about this person. You want to be off this list? It's great leverage if you're an FBI agent looking to build a case.
I'm trying to say that the problem is not just the United States. Look, if you are surveilled by the IDF, you may be blackmailed, you may be defamed, you may be murdered. So to my mind, that is what we really face, is that the hardest edge of the surveillance machine is a sharpened knife. And I'm sorry to disagree with Ryan. I want you to walk out if you're absolutely fucking scared. It's amazing what we put up with. It's amazing to me that there isn't more outrage.
Classifying you in ways that you do not want to be classified. The recourse is to sort of limit the amount of data that you're making available to them.
Thank you.
And then Kunal.
Joe, do you mind coming up and saying?
I found one of the positions that you mentioned early on very interesting. The one that pertained to the constant possibility of the surveillance state collapsing at any point, that it is not inevitable in any sense. And in many ways I found that at odds with many things that were said by other panelists. And so I would love to hear the other three panelists respond to that directly and what their perspective on that. Maybe you can restate because I probably didn't do a good job of saying it, and then have the other panelists
The insight I'm sharing is an old one, which is that capitalism always does things in a half-assed, halfway manner, and that an entire sector has grown up to convince us that the job has been fully done when it hasn't been. And this has been observable for 150 years. So I'm not simply making an observation about the narrow thing about surveillance. Because to me, surveillance has really grown in capitalism and obeys a lot of its laws, and that surveillance is just as much in a crisis mode as capitalism is. It just has better sales reps and PR people. So I think maybe that would be specifying what it is that you want the other panelists to bounce off.
I'll jump in here and speak to that. I think that there's enough momentum and alliances between corporations and the government that I'm going to argue that it has become a kind of stable, surveillance ecosphere that we're living in, and that this is something I overheard at a conference, and maybe I wasn't supposed to hear it, so I always like to share it. And this was at a biometrics conference about spoofing and anti-spoofing, and so there were some CEOs from biometrics companies, and they were discussing the likely possibility that two companies, Google and Facebook, would eventually partner with the US government to become an identity provider. So your passport is a way to verify your identity, and it's a very important thing that your passport, your driver's license does. And Facebook does that, and Google does that. Microsoft Passport didn't really do that, and so they kind of disappeared. But Facebook and Google have come in, and so if they're not already kind of augmenting the abilities of the government's capabilities to identify you, then I foresee that happening.
I don't see surveillance collapsing anytime soon. They use fear to sell it. We need to protect our country. We need to protect your family, and fear sells. Just like youth, happiness, these things sell. So I don't see it collapsing anytime soon.
I agree. I mean, it's a hugely profitable, massive machine. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think that it's probably unlikely.
Did people say that about the most deeply embedded, fierce totalitarian regimes? And in my lifetime, I watched people take down the Berlin Wall. In my lifetime, I'll see other things like that too. I can't live accepting the idea that they've won, especially since I've seen it. But also, I don't know if I could really at least live the life that I was living thinking they've won. Otherwise, if they've really won, who's the agent here? You would be. You would be.
I think that
I don't think you should accept. I mean, I think you should continue to fight and continue to be angry and continue to push back. But if someone is asking me, do I realistically see an end to this in my lifetime? No. I mean, we're still wrapped up in fear over a thing that happened 13 years ago. It's still guiding policy every day. I mean, yeah, no.
I think there is a unique opportunity right now to make a lot of change and to take this perspective and apply it to what's happening so that it can be changed. Otherwise, if what had happened in the last year with Snowden's document disclosures had not happened, where would we be today? I mean, really downward slope towards even more abuses. So I think there is an opportunity right now to keep this momentum going, keep pushing further.
Okay. I just want to add one more thing, and just going off of Phil's point, we really haven't seen like a whole, I mean, we haven't seen a revolution, we've seen people fighting, but it is important to be aware and to fight against this, otherwise it's just going to keep, as both Bill and Adam mentioned, it's going to keep accelerating and increasing the amount of surveillance. About 10 years ago, when Google was first launching, there was a friend of the family who was a lawyer who recommended that we Google our name first, and I'm sure you guys have heard that, to Google your name, make sure you know in control of what's out there. And he actually recommended that it's good to have a common name, names that a lot of other people have, because then you're a lot safer. And that was 10 years ago, and now I've had professors and different people tell me, oh, you should Google your name and try to work Google Analytics so you can own the first page of your name. So it's just amazing how fast this can accelerate, and it's important to keep control. Kunal, do you want to come up?
What was your name? What was your name? Steve. Steve, okay.
I actually just wanted, I liked the problem you brought up of scale, and I think it's fun to answer, but I helped organize these series, the second one, but the first one we focused on, I'm not Muslim, but the rest of the panel in general, there's a lot of Muslim participants who dealt with these kinds of issues because they were targeted and are targeted. And the one answer that comes to mind to your question, and something I want to throw into the conversation, was I have an experience, and I don't know if there's any sort of way to put it all together with what we know now, but I have an experience where I had a phone call that I made and was put away on the contents of that phone call within 2 hours, maybe 1 hour, in 2001. So to me that brings up that whatever the scale is, it's pretty high. I'm not a dangerous person, I'm an art organizer, and I've always been more or less an art organizer. It's a really strange person to encounter that kind of behavior by the NYPD. Now, I don't want to get into the structural issues of that because we don't actually have that information to talk about. But I like that there's publications like the Intercept and others that do try to figure out the scale and publish the scale. But at some point, you get a sense. It's X million people in this country. So if you look at yourself and you see 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100, you can sort of figure out what kind of protection you need to put in place for the kinds of activities you're doing. In case, to me, the way it influences me, these experiences influence me in this data that the Intercept and other publications influenced me, and very usefully, is that when I'm organizing something that's interesting and might get shut down or whatever, I might as well take scale into account and just be very careful about communication so these things have a chance so that these events and things that we care about have a chance to survive. I actually think it's useful to take those protections as soon as the scale is very high, and that you are targeted if you are doing something you think is targeted.
As scary as the states pooling and larger institutions become, should we be more afraid of a culture of self-surveillance, where we start to appreciate services that are inherently more parsable by the states, and the things that have backlogs, the way we chat and the way we talk now, are just inherently easier to parse, and that we ourselves value these services, and we're as a culture we start to value things that
Thanks, guys. So my question is more about how to talk about surveillance. So I work with lawyers who litigate in the government around issues of national security and surveillance. And I know that one issue that they encounter frequently is, in terms of the messaging around this. And I see a couple of issues with how this is discussed generally. One way, white men can discuss and whine about their First Amendment rights. And so I'm wondering, what do you think is the best way to discuss this in a way that will best mobilize people? I mean, if we're aiming to like combat the surveillance state as effectively as possible and in as wide a scale as possible, how do we do this by getting the most people involved, and how do we make people feel complicit and responsible and affected?
I believe I started to answer your question when I said that I found that surveillance is not an issue of rights. Because otherwise you do get the very comic situation of white guys saying my First Amendment rights were violated. So I think it's much more useful if you make it a social issue and ask people with the materials that we have at the stage we are in history, it's a social question. And everybody, I think, can say, this is not the society that I want, but that the way that the conversation really gets going to something meaningful is, what do you want? And that what the artists can do is a way of indicating, this is what I do want in society, rather than simply say, I don't want surveillance, or what do you want? So my suggestion was to stay away from rights issues, and it was actually Norman Siegel of the ACLU who told me that it's very easy to dismiss any of the amendment-based rights. Case law, working your way around it, but if you say, no, I don't like this society, and we need to have a referendum on it, that seems to grab people's attention.
Look, surveillance is about power. Be anti-surveillance, but actually what you want is to have power over somebody else's surveillance, and whoever has more surveillance equipment and technology has more power. And so we need spies for the people. Yeah.
I must disagree with that, because I use the analogy of guns. They've got guns, so we got to get guns. Or they've got better guns, so we got better guns. There can be no arms race with surveillance technology. As I said before, get rid of it all.
Yeah, it's a question that we have wrestled with as a media organization, and I've talked about at length with lawyers at different sort of civil liberties lawyers, and it's really hard because in the media landscape right now, commentary and reporting on these issues is dominated by guys that look like me, and people who are impacted by this are not. So I think it's a matter of more stories that humanize, more stories that actually describe an experience like we heard tonight, like how this actually plays out when it happens to somebody. Because when you hear just the numbers of, like NSA is collecting X number of data, whatever, like your eyes start to gloss over and it just becomes boring. I get bored by all of these NSA stories, and I work in a place that's publishing a bunch of them because it just feels like the same thing over and over again. I think for a lot of people, you need to hear stories that tell you about what somebody went through, and I think that that's really missing in the conversation about all of this stuff.
One more thing that there are a lot of modes of thinking that are introduced by people, companies, large companies with a lot of power behind them. For example, Google and Eric Schmidt, and pushing the idea that if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to hide. There was a writer, Julian Baggini, I think, who around 2006 had a great essay about how that's total crap, and it is. But that argument, which has been ubiquitous since the whole last decade. It took us how long to debunk that and start to see through it? A really long time. And that's a very effective form of propaganda, is to convince people of these ideas and ways of thinking that aren't true, but that do benefit the people who are saying them. So when you hear somebody say something like that, always think, what's the motivation behind them saying